Nick Reiner grew up in a world most people only ever see on a movie screen. He was the youngest son of director and actor Rob Reiner, the filmmaker behind classics like When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, and Stand By Me. His mother, Michelle Singer Reiner, was a photographer, producer, and a respected advocate for LGBTQ rights. His grandfather was comedy legend Carl Reiner. From the outside, this was Hollywood royalty, wealth, connections, and a family that was deeply entrenched in the entertainment industry and progressive politics. But behind the scenes, the Reiners were fighting a private war that would last for years. Their youngest son's addiction, mental illness, and escalating volatility. It was a story Nick himself tried to tell and make sense of in a film he co-wrote, Being Charlie. And then, in late December of 2025, that story took a turn almost no one could have imagined. Nick Reiner was arrested and charged with the brutal murders of his own parents. This is the disturbing story of Nick Reiner, from teenage addiction to homelessness to a semi-autobiographical movie about recovery, and finally to an alleged double homicide that has shocked Hollywood and raised agonizing questions about mental illness, intervention, and responsibility. Nick has said himself that he grew up in comfort. There were no financial hardships, no lack of opportunity. He was surrounded by successful artists and activists, raised in Brentwood, one of Los Angeles' wealthiest neighborhoods. In interviews, he acknowledged the privilege of that background, even as he was describing his drug use. He had the kind of safety net most addicts never get. Despite that, or maybe in part because of how insulated his world was, Nick started using drugs in his mid-teens. Multiple outlets report that he first experimented with substances around the age of 15. That is also when he went to rehab for the first time. While most kids his age were navigating high school and first crushes, Nick was already entering the world of detox programs, group therapy, and strict treatment regimens. What began as teenage experimentation quickly turned into a pattern. Over the years, he gravitated toward harder drugs, including heroin and stimulants. The spiral was so intense that by his early 20s, he had already accumulated experiences that would later fuel a full-length movie script about addiction, institutions, and the toxic dance between an addicted son and a powerful father. The sheer number of rehabs Nick cycled through became a grim shorthand for how entrenched his addiction had become. He has described being sent to about 17 different treatment facilities across the United States. These were not modest community clinics. His family could afford some of the most intensive and expensive programs in the country. One of the places he ended up was Little Hill Alina Lodge in New Jersey, a so-called last stop rehab known for its strict structure and tough environment. This was not glossy Malibu recovery with ocean views. It was designed for people who had failed elsewhere, places where the philosophy was often break you down to build you back up. Rob Reiner would later talk publicly about this period, especially as he was promoting Being Charlie. He used the phrase tough love to describe the choices he and Michelle felt forced to make. At various points, they cut Nick off financially, refused to rescue him from the consequences of relapses, and sent him to harsher programs in hopes that something, anything, might stick. The cruelty of addiction is that money, power, and connections do not guarantee success. Even with 17 rehabs, therapists, doctors, and an entire support system, Nick kept relapsing. Journalists who covered Being Charlie emphasized how important this detail was. The Reiners tried almost everything available to privileged families, and it still was not enough. As the rehab merry-go-round continued, Nick's life became more chaotic and more transient. In a 2016 interview, he talked openly about the years he spent homeless. He said he had been on the streets in Maine, in New Jersey, and in Texas. Sometimes it was a few nights, sometimes it was weeks. These periods often followed a now familiar pattern. He would be discharged or walk away from a rehab program and refuse to go back or accept the next placement. He explained the logic in stark terms. If he wanted to avoid the residential treatment centers his parents and clinicians were recommending, he had to be homeless. In other words, the only way to escape the system of structured recovery that his family kept trying to put him into was to choose the streets instead. A detailed podcast account described how some of those rehab discharges ended. In at least one case, Nick was dropped off at a Salvation Army shelter. Instead of following the plan towards sober living or outpatient care, he chose the road, crashes on couches, and low-budget shelters. For all the glamour associated with the Reiner name, His lived reality at times was nearly indistinguishable from thousands of anonymous young men drifting through America's underfunded, overburdened addiction and homelessness systems. Out of that chaos, Nick tried to create art. During a period of sobriety in his early 20s, he began writing what would become the script for Being Charlie. Released in 2015 and often referenced in 2016 coverage, the film was directed by Rob Reiner and co-written by Nick. Critics and reference sources describe it explicitly as being based on his experiences with heroin addiction and homelessness. In the movie, the main character is a privileged teenage boy from a politically prominent family, addicted to heroin, cycling through rehabs, rebelling against authority, and clashing bitterly with his father, who is running for governor. The character escapes from a treatment center, ends up in shelters and on the streets, and falls into a tumultuous relationship with a fellow patient. The parallels to Nick's real life were not subtle. In interviews, he acknowledged that the script was his way of processing years of addiction, institutionalization, and intense family conflict, especially with his father. Rob directing the film added another layer, a father literally staging his son's version of their shared trauma in front of cameras and audiences. Being Charlie did not become a huge box office hit, but within the addiction and recovery communities, it was noted for its rawness. It did not offer a clean redemption arc. It showed relapse, denial, and the ugly underside of tough love parenting. It seemed at the time like a sign that maybe Nick was turning a corner, using storytelling to make sense of his past and move forward. But addiction and mental illness are almost never a straight line. In the years after the film, people close to the family have said that Nick's struggles did not simply vanish. Reports describe ongoing relapses, mood swings, and mounting mental health problems. At some point, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was prescribed antipsychotic medication, a complicated class of drugs that can be life-saving for some patients, but can also cause severe side effects and, in rare cases, worsen agitation or paranoia. According to later reporting, Nick's psychiatric medication regimen was changed roughly 3 to 4 weeks before the killings in December of 2025. Those changes, some sources say, may have destabilized him further. There were also indications that substance abuse remained a factor during this period, creating a dangerous intersection of mental illness, medication issues, and addiction. Friends and acquaintances described his behavior in the months leading up to the murders as increasingly concerning and erratic. In one earlier incident he himself had spoken about, Nick destroyed parts of his parents' home during a stimulant-fueled episode. It was a glimpse into how quickly his volatility could turn destructive, even in the supposed safety of the family house. All of this formed the backdrop to a single weekend in December of 2025. On the evening of December 13th, the Reiners attended a holiday party hosted by Conan O'Brien. This was a typical Hollywood gathering of comics, actors, and industry figures, but multiple witnesses later reported that Nick got into a loud altercation with his father during the event. His behavior was described as erratic and agitated. Rob and Michelle ended up leaving the party early. Sometime in the early morning hours of December 14th, in the Brentwood home where Nick had grown up, Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were killed. Investigators later said both had suffered multiple sharp force injuries. The brutality of the attack stunned those who had known them as a devoted couple and as fiercely protective parents. The discovery of the bodies was itself tragic. A massage therapist arrived at the house and, unable to reach Rob, contacted their daughter Romy. She came to the home and found her father's body. Michelle's body was discovered later in another part of the residence. It was an unthinkable scene for any family member, made even more horrifying by the prominence of the victims. In the hours after the murders, Nick's movements were tracked across Los Angeles. At around 4 in the morning, he checked into a Santa Monica hotel room. Staff later found blood in the shower and on the mattress. Later that day, around 9:15 in the evening, surveillance footage showed him walking into a gas station near the University of Southern California. Not long after, he was surrounded,
showing Nick Reiner calmly strolling near his parents' home hours before the murders. This was obtained by the New York Post. Let's take a look at it. It's video 1. It's just a sidewalk. This is just him
and arrested
walking
by
for the listening
police.
audience. He has
2
a bag
days
of-
later, on December 16th, formal charges were filed. Nick Reiner, then 32 years old, was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances for multiple victims. Prosecutors also added a special allegation that he had used a deadly weapon, a knife. Under California law, the special circumstances charges mean he faces either life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. The case was assigned to Los Angeles County District Attorney Nathan Hochman. Nick's family retained a high-profile criminal defense lawyer, Alan Jackson, known for representing clients in nationally watched cases, including Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey. Nick was held without bail. When he first
Hollywood director Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner. The 32-year-old is now being held on no bail. Welcome to the Fox 11 News at 5, simulcast on Fox 11 Plus. I'm Susan Hirasuna, here for Christine Devine. The entertainment world shocked by this tragic violence, a chilling argument at a celebrity holiday party, possibly
appeared in
at the
court
center
on
of it
December
all.
17th,
Fox 11's
he
Christina
looked disoriented and frail. His arraignment was quickly postponed to early January of 2026 after his attorney told the judge that Nick had not been medically cleared to participate fully in the proceedings. Behind the scenes, questions were already swirling about his mental competence, his schizophrenia diagnosis, his recent medication changes, and whether his defense team might eventually pursue an insanity plea. The allegations sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. Rob Reiner was not just a director, he was a political voice, a liberal activist, and a beloved figure across generations. Michelle was widely respected for her advocacy and for supporting LGBTQ causes. The idea that their own son, the child whose struggles they had tried so publicly and painfully to understand and support, might have killed them was almost impossible for friends to process. Yet, when you pull back and trace the arc of Nick's life, the horror sits alongside a set of painfully familiar themes. This is a story about how addiction can ravage even the most privileged families. It is about how mental illness, especially serious conditions like schizophrenia, complicates every effort at treatment. It is about the limitations of tough love, the failures of a rehab system that can cycle someone through 17 facilities without delivering lasting stability, and the desperate calculus that families face as they try to balance compassion and boundaries with safety. Sources close to the Reiners have said that Rob and Michelle never stopped trying to help Nick, even when he did not take that help seriously. They funded programs, arranged care, and were involved in his creative attempts to make sense of his life. Being Charlie was, in many ways, an artistic plea for understanding. But understanding alone is not always enough to prevent catastrophe. As the legal process moves forward, the courts will have to wrestle with questions of intent, sanity, and culpability. Prosecutors will argue that this was a deliberate, premeditated double murder. The defense will likely highlight Nick's schizophrenia, the recent medication changes, his history of psychosis, and the possibility that, in the crucial hours of December 14th, he was not in control of his mind. Whatever the verdict, the case forces a broader, more uncomfortable conversation. When someone has a long and public history of addiction and serious mental illness, what are the realistic limits of what a family can do? At what point should medical systems or the state intervene more forcefully? And are those systems even equipped to do so? The life and alleged crimes of Nick Reiner sit at the intersection of all these questions. A boy born into comfort and fame, who fell into addiction as a teenager, was shuffled through nearly 20 rehabs, lived on the streets by choice and by consequence, turned his story into a film in an attempt to heal, and now stands accused of killing the very parents who never stopped trying to save him. It is a reminder that behind celebrity homes and red carpet photos, there can be crises as profound and sometimes as deadly as any faced by families far from the spotlight. And it leaves us with a disturbing thought. If all the resources, connections, and attention that surrounded Nick Reiner were still not enough to prevent this outcome, what hope do less visible families have when they are fighting the same battles in silence?